Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'll be taking a look at Herbin Bleu Nuit. I'll be doing writing samples on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at some writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. Compare Herbin Bleu Nuit to several blue inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Herbin Bleu Nuit had trouble grabbing the paper when using my glass dip nib. You can see up here when I did the little scribble, usually that's more of a wetter blob of ink, but it's a little more wispy in this example. The swatch that I made with tweezers is nice and crisp on this Tomoe River paper, but in some of the other writing samples, it had a little difficulty holding on to the paper. You can see this ink has the possibility for some shading given the range of shades you see in this swatch. I'm not seeing any sheen in the drip at the end of the swatch, and there's just a slight hint of a halo of darker ink. I'll begin with a writing sample using my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. There was just a slight hard start here, and I've noticed that a bit with this ink. Sometimes, depending on the pen or the nib, there's trouble grabbing the paper. Now, the line is nice and crisp and legible. It's pretty fine. Sometimes this extra fine nib can vary in boldness depending on the ink, and this is usually the finest line that I'll see. This ink and nib combination does make a very fine line, but it's very nice. I'm not having to put pressure on this very fine nib, so it's writing fairly smooth considering it's an extra fine. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Grants. It has a fine number 3 size 14 karat fine nib. This 14 karat nib is quite a bit wetter, and I find it to be much more pleasant to write with. It's quite a bit bolder, and I'm looking at this in my viewfinder. To me, it's much more legible. Next, I've got a Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel fine nib. I've done several writing samples with this Grants and Lucina side by side, and on quite a few of the writing samples, these two feel and look indistinguishable in the way that they write. And I'm noticing that here on this Tomoe River paper, the wetness is very similar, the line width and the boldness is very similar. So both of these are very nice. They put down just the right amount of ink. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Explorer. It has a stainless steel medium nib. A little bit of a hard start there. I'm noticing that on this style of stainless steel nib, I'm having these hard starts. Nice and wet and enjoyable on this paper. I've done some other writing samples where this nib was less pleasant. You see here on the P, on that downstroke, it may not be noticeable on the video, but it had just a slight skip there. Um, but on this particular writing sample, I would go ahead and classify it as nice. The amount of ink that it's putting down is appropriate for the line width, and it looks good. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a number 5 size 14 karat medium nib, so it's just slightly bigger than the nib on the Grants. No hard start on this nice wet gold nib. I feel like on these little small, I think these are 5 millimeter grids, this just looks a little too wet and a little too sloppy because it goes back and forth between really wet and really dry. But I'm going to see, maybe if I have a larger handwriting, it might feel a little better. A bit of a little skip there. I get that a lot whenever I'm using a Pilot pen. When I make the P, the downstroke skips a little bit there at the beginning. The L skipped. I do like this medium a bit more for larger printing, but just me stopping and talking about it skipping, I feel like it caused it to skip some more. This is a pretty smooth nib, and I think on this smooth paper, it might have just the slightest hint of baby's bottom or over polishing. Next, I'll be writing with my Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat hard medium nib. I've just noticed recently that this Sailor 1911 has those same drier upstrokes that I've noticed as a characteristic on a lot of Pilot 14 karat gold nibs. But there's something the way this Sailor applies the ink to the page. It's not glassy smooth. It feels relatively smooth, but I'm hearing some audible feedback, like there's just the slightest bit of roughness to the nib that tends to spread the ink out on the page, and it doesn't cause these pools of ink like you see on the really smooth Pilot medium nibs. This ink just looks really good in this nib. And I hear a nice scritchy scratchy sound as I'm writing. It's very pleasant. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This Kaweco broad nib is very pleasant. It's not glassy smooth with this ink. I feel the nib on the page, and it's nice. I feel like I have more control, and I'm seeing just some subtle shading. I'm going to try the reverse writing. Reverse writing is putting down a consistent flow of ink. It's a little bit light though, but still very usable. And finally, I've got my Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. I was expecting this to feel a little dry on the page, but it was very pleasant. It was not glassy smooth, but just barely had that little bit of velvety feel to it. This was very nice. While that dries, I'll take a look at some other writing samples. With the glass dip nib, I noticed, just like with any ink, you have to kind of rotate the glass dip nib to, as you write, to get to a ridge that still has some ink in it. But this seemed a bit more noticeable than other inks. Like I had trouble, you had to get it in just the right spot for the ink to be able to grab the page. And I noticed the same thing with the tweezer swatch that I made. I couldn't just swipe it across the page. I had to make sure I had the tweezers positioned just right so that it would continue to put ink down. Just like on the Tomoe River paper, the stub nib felt velvety, though on this paper I did feel a little more feedback. It was more of a velvety feel, whereas on the Tomoe River, it was just a hint of velvetiness. With my Kaweco, I wanted to say that it felt dry, but as I was writing it, I noticed it felt pretty smooth. It just sounded dry. And the same thing with the 1911. I could hear that scritchy, scratchy sound and feel a little bit of feedback, but it was very pleasant to write with. With the Pilot Custom Heritage 91, I could feel that drag on the paper. It was smooth, but kind of wanted to stick to the paper at the same time, not like it was catching on the paper, but like a rubbery feel. But if you look at these two, I do prefer the way the Sailor medium nib looked. The Custom Heritage 91, the medium nib just looked a little more blobby. The Explorer didn't want to grab the page. I found that I had to put just slightly more force than is natural for me. Now, when I did that, when I used more force when I was writing, it looked really good, but it felt dry, and with it feeling dry and pressing even just slightly harder on the paper was just slightly uncomfortable. The Lucina and the Grants were basically indistinguishable on this writing sample. They both put down a nice, attractive looking line. You can see the wetness is very similar. The Kakuno actually felt better than the Explorer. You can see it was able to actually grab the paper, and so I was able to write with a lighter hand, and I was kind of surprised. It actually felt okay, but I did prefer the Grants more. On the copy paper with the two wider nibs, the writing felt very nice and the ink looked nice going down on the paper, but just seconds after I wrote, I could see the ink spreading, and you can see the letters look a little ragged. Sometimes those ragged letters look kind of nice, look vintagey, but this just doesn't look attractive to me. The reverse writing with the broad nib, I can see little feathers on it also. The same thing on the Sailor 1911, which normally puts down a nice looking line on fountain pen friendly paper. It was nice, and you can see I almost put a smiley face, but I meant to put an X. It didn't look its best. And the Pilot Custom Heritage 91 looked even worse because we know how it leaves blobs of ink at the end of each stroke. And you can see it's even wetter than the Sailor. So it was too wet to use on copy paper. I was pleasantly surprised with the Explorer. There was no trouble with it grabbing the paper. I didn't have to use any force to get it to make a nice, bold line. The Pilot Explorer was probably the best nib on this paper, the most pleasant and put down the most attractive line. The Lucina, which I said a lot of times feels like the Grants, looks noticeably lighter. It was nice to write with, but it didn't make the ink look its best. For a fine line, the Grants was definitely the best choice. But the Pilot Kakuno, I was surprised by the nice bold line that it put down, and again I was able to write with a light hand. Blue Nuit was more prone to come through the page than Blue Myosotis. In my old bullet journal, you can see Herbin Bleu Nuit right beside Blue Myosotis, and you can see Blue Myosotis looks a little more purple. They're very similar in color, but when I first did this writing sample, they looked even closer in color. The wet Herbin Bleu Nuit looks even more similar to Blue Myosotis, but as it dried, this one turned more blue. The Bleu Nuit became more blue. I like the opaqueness of this Bleu Nuit and just very little bits of shading. This ink has like a chalky matteness to it that I really like. Herbin Bleu Nuit is more blue, whereas Blue Myosotis, you can see a bit more purple in it. And I feel like the Atramentis Sherlock Holmes, which is also called Night Blue, is just a hint more purple and a bit darker. You don't get these lighter shades like you do in Blue Nuit. I'm needing to make a new swatch card for Oxford Blue. I made this one when these swatch cards were new, and I'm seeing that Oxford Blue has the potential for a little bit of lighter shades, but this is just a very much more saturated version of this type of blue. Shinkai is a little more blue-black. Tsukiyo, you can see that it has just the slightest hint of green to it. It's more of a turquoise black, maybe. Blue Myosotis was similar in color to Noodler's Kung Ta Ching, which was an ink that tended to really spread. But Bleu Nuit is more similar to Noodler's 54th. They're not exactly the same. Noodler's 54th has a little more of a gray color to it, but they're both that powdery blue kind of color. But Noodler's 54th spreads very badly. You can see on this nice fountain pen friendly paper how much it just soaks straight into the paper and spreads. Manyo Kikyu is more of a blue-black, and Mysterious Blue is kind of similar to Bleu Nuit, but not exactly the same. And Serenity Blue is much brighter and leans a little more purple. I should mention that the two Waterman inks are much better behaved in a wider variety of nibs than the Herbin ink is. Herbin Bleu Nuit does have a very nice water-resistant component. Now, the component of the ink that did lift off the page left a little halo of color, but what's left behind is very crisp and very legible. Here's how it compares to the Blue Myosotis water resistance test. Okay, and on the Tomoe River paper, I'm not seeing anything even on the heavy bits of the swatch. Nothing's wanting to come through the page. Got a little bit of show through in the wider nibs. I have the 3 pins that I noted with exclamation points that kind of stood out. The broader nibs, the broad and the stub, most inks are enjoyable to write with in those nibs, so I didn't make a special note. Those 3 just stood out because maybe they kind of surprised me a little. But after doing a little journaling with each of those nibs, the Sailor 1911, I think, is the one that really kind of stands out the most as the most enjoyable. I really like the matte, chalky look of this ink after it dries, and you're able to kind of get that effect in the medium nib. Whereas the 2 fine nibs here, they're very legible, but the chalkiness of the ink isn't as obvious. This ink kind of reminds me of a worn pair of blue jeans. I kind of get that vibe from it. It just feels comfortable. I think I would like this ink for journaling. In fact, I have done some journaling with it, and it's just very comfortable and calming. It's a nice ink for that. But like I mentioned as I was going through doing the writing samples, pens with drier nibs, it's really going to depend on what paper you're using. But then again, the wetter nibs were a little too wet for the copy paper. The pens that did well on both, you lose out on the attractiveness of the ink. You have to sacrifice some of the attractiveness. So, you just have this is one of those inks you just have to pick your priority. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.